Hello everyone, and welcome back. Today, we are exploring a thought-provoking question: what if colonialism never happened? To begin this journey, let us start with one of the most visible impacts colonialism left behind the borders of our modern world. If colonialism had never taken place, the map we know today would look completely different. Many national borders across Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia were drawn by distant powers with little understanding of local history, culture, or social structures. These borders often ignored long-standing communities and grouped together people with different languages, traditions, and identities under a single political system. In a world without colonialism, borders would likely have developed more gradually and organically. They might have followed natural features like rivers and mountains, or evolved from existing kingdoms, trade regions, and cultural networks. Instead of straight lines on a map, boundaries would reflect shared language, customs, and historical ties formed over centuries. This does not mean there would be no borders or no disagreements. Human societies have always negotiated space and influence. However, these boundaries would be shaped primarily by local interaction rather than external decisions made far away.
Drone is
As a
airborne.
result, many modern
To peace
tensions
and
rooted in
understanding.
artificial
and to
borders
shared
might never have
prosperity.
emerged in the
Together,
same way.
we build.
More importantly, borders would not just be political lines, they would carry meaning. They would represent stories, shared memories, and identities that develop naturally over time. People might feel a stronger sense of connection to the regions they live in, because those regions were defined by their own history, not imposed frameworks. By reimagining borders in this way, we begin to see how deeply colonialism reshaped the modern world and how different global relationships, identities, and challenges might be if that reshaping had never occurred. And this is only the beginning of the story. Many of today's long-lasting conflicts are deeply tied to borders created without local consent. When boundaries ignore cultural, ethnic, or historical realities, tension becomes almost inevitable. In a world where colonialism never happened, many of these flashpoints might not exist in their current form. Without externally imposed borders, political divisions would likely have emerged through gradual negotiation, migration, trade, and shared governance. Communities that had lived together for generations would not suddenly find themselves separated by new lines, while unrelated groups would not be forced into the same political system overnight. This alone could reduce the scale and intensity of many disputes that later hardened into long-term instability. Conflicts, of course, would not disappear entirely. Competition over land, resources, and influence is part of human history in every region of the world. However, these disputes would be more localized and shaped by internal dynamics rather than global power struggles. Instead of conflicts fueled or prolonged by outside interests, disagreements would be addressed within familiar cultural and social frameworks. Another key difference lies in legitimacy. Borders that grow organically tend to be viewed as more legitimate by the people who live within them. When communities recognize a shared past and mutual interests, political compromise becomes more possible. In contrast, borders seen as artificial often lack public trust, making cooperation harder and resentment easier to sustain. This alternative path could also mean fewer conflicts escalating onto the global stage. Without colonial powers redrawing maps and later intervening to protect strategic interests, many regional disputes might remain regional, resolved through diplomacy, alliances, or gradual change rather than prolonged confrontation. Ultimately, the absence of colonial border making would not create a conflict-free world, but it could create one where disagreements are less rigid, less inherited, and less tied to historical decisions made far from the people most affected by them. Without colonialism, many indigenous civilizations across Africa, Asia, and the Americas would have continued their development without sudden disruption. Before foreign domination, these societies already had complex systems of governance, education, trade, and cultural exchange that were shaped by their own environments and values. Instead of being dismantled or replaced, local institutions would have evolved naturally over time. Kingdoms, city-states, and regional alliances would have adapted to internal challenges, technological change, and shifting trade routes. This process of gradual transformation often leads to stability, because change comes from within rather than being imposed from outside. Knowledge systems would play a crucial role in this evolution. Traditional science, medicine, architecture, and agriculture, often dismissed or erased under colonial rule, would remain central to daily life. These systems were based on generations of observation and experimentation, tailored to local climates and resources. Over time, they could have merged with new ideas from neighboring regions through trade and cultural contact, creating unique paths of innovation. Economic development would also follow a different trajectory. Instead of economies being reshaped to extract raw materials for distant markets, production would focus on regional needs and long-term sustainability. Trade networks that already connected Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and East Asia could have expanded further, strengthening cooperation without domination. Cultural identity would remain intact and dynamic. Languages, art forms, belief systems, and social structures would continue to change organically rather than being replaced by foreign models. This continuity allows societies to modernize while still preserving a strong sense of historical identity. In this scenario, the modern world would not be divided into advanced and developing regions in the same way. Instead, it would consist of multiple centers of civilization, each progressing along its own timeline, shaped by local priorities rather than external control. Long before colonial expansion, many societies around the world had already reached high levels of sophistication. Complex political systems, centers of learning, and long-distance trade networks were not exceptions. They were common features across Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and the Americas. Education was often deeply valued. Cities such as Timbuktu were known for scholarship, libraries, and academic exchange, while regions in South Asia and East Asia had established traditions in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and engineering. Knowledge was preserved through written texts, oral traditions, and practical training, allowing ideas to be passed down and refined over generations. Trade connected these societies across vast distances. Spices, textiles, metals, and ideas moved along routes that linked continents together. These exchanges encouraged innovation and cooperation, spreading techniques in navigation, architecture, and agriculture. Economic growth was not isolated. It was part of a shared global system long before modern globalization. Governance systems were equally diverse and advanced. Some societies practiced centralized administration, while others relied on councils, customary law, or federated structures. These systems were designed to reflect local values and social organization, offering stability through familiarity and shared responsibility. Without colonial disruption, these institutions would have continued to evolve. Rather than being dismantled or replaced, they would adapt to new challenges, incorporating innovation while maintaining cultural continuity. This process allows progress without cultural erasure, strengthening societies instead of fragmenting them. The idea that modern advancement required outside intervention overlooks this deep history of achievement. Many regions were already on paths of growth shaped by their own priorities and environments. Recognizing this helps reframe global history not as a story of progress delivered from one place to another, but as a shared human journey with many starting points and many directions forward. Without colonialism, industrial development would not follow a single, uniform model. Instead of one region setting the standard for progress, multiple societies would advance along paths shaped by their own environments, resources, and needs. Innovation would emerge as a response to local challenges rather than external pressure. Many regions already possessed the foundations for large-scale development. Skilled craftsmanship, organized labor systems, and deep scientific knowledge existed long before industrial machinery appeared elsewhere. With time, these elements could evolve into mechanized production, energy systems, and infrastructure suited to local conditions. Industrial growth in river-based civilizations, for example, might prioritize water-powered technology, while regions rich in solar exposure could develop early alternatives focused on climate efficiency. This diversity of development would reduce dependence on a single global center of manufacturing. Instead of raw materials flowing in one direction and finished goods returning in another, production chains would be more balanced and regional. Local economies would retain greater control over their resources, allowing long-term planning rather than short-term extraction. Technological exchange would still occur through trade and diplomacy, but it would be based on cooperation rather than domination. Ideas would spread horizontally between societies, not imposed from the top down. This kind of exchange encourages adaptation, as communities modify new technologies to fit their own social structures and values. Industrial growth without external control could also mean fewer extreme disruptions to social life. Rapid, enforced transformation often strains communities, but gradual change allows traditions, labor practices, and social systems to adjust over time. Progress would not require cultural replacement to be considered successful. In this world, industrialization would not be a single historical event tied to one region. It would be an ongoing global process, unfolding differently across continents. The result would be a modern world built from many forms of innovation, each reflecting the priorities and creativity of the societies that developed them. European dominance on the global stage was closely tied to the wealth and influence gained through colonial expansion. Without colonialism, this concentration of power would be far less likely to occur. Europe would still develop and participate in global affairs, but it would not stand so far above other regions. Economic growth in Europe would rely mainly on internal resources, regional trade, and technological innovation rather than large-scale extraction from overseas territories. This would naturally limit the speed and scale at which wealth could accumulate. At the same time, other regions would retain control over their own labor, land, and resources, allowing them to grow without being systematically drained. Global power would therefore be more evenly distributed. Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and the Americas would remain influential centers of trade, culture, and innovation. Instead of one dominant bloc shaping global rules, multiple regions would participate in setting standards for commerce, diplomacy, and technology. This balance of power could lead to a more multipolar world. International relations would be shaped by negotiation and partnership rather than hierarchy. No single region would have the ability to impose its political systems, economic models, or cultural norms on the rest of the world without resistance. Cultural influence would also be more diverse. Art, philosophy, science, and social ideas would flow from many directions, not just from Europe outward. Global culture would be richer and less uniform, shaped by a wider range of perspectives. Such a world would still experience rivalry and competition, but dominance would be harder to maintain. Power would shift over time between regions, reflecting innovation, cooperation, and internal stability rather than historical advantage gained through expansion. In the absence of colonialism, global power would not concentrate heavily in one region. Instead, influence would be shared among several centers across different continents. Political, economic, and cultural leadership would shift based on innovation, stability, and cooperation rather than inherited advantage. Regions would rise and fall in influence independently. When one society experienced growth, others would not necessarily be weakened by it. This creates a global system where progress in one place does not depend on decline elsewhere. Trade and diplomacy would be built on mutual benefit rather than control. Economic relationships would reflect this balance. Instead of supply chains designed to favor a dominant power, regional economies would trade as partners. Resources, technology, and knowledge would circulate in multiple directions. This kind of exchange encourages resilience, as no single region would be essential to the functioning of the entire system. Political influence would also be less rigid. Alliances would form based on shared interests and cultural understanding rather than pressure from powerful external forces. Decision-making on global issues would require broader consensus, slowing sudden shifts but strengthening long-term cooperation. Cultural authority would follow a similar pattern. Ideas about governance, education, and social organization would emerge from many societies, each offering its own solutions. No single model would be treated as universally superior. This diversity allows societies to choose systems that fit their values rather than copying an external standard. A more balanced world would still face competition and disagreement, but power would be spread widely enough to prevent long-term dominance by any one region. Global influence would remain fluid, shaped by continuous interaction rather than fixed hierarchy. Without colonialism, the extreme economic gaps between regions would be far less pronounced. Much of today's global inequality emerged from systems that transferred wealth from one part of the world to another over long periods of time. Without that sustained imbalance, economic development would follow a more even trajectory. Regions would retain greater control over their natural resources and labor. Instead of economies being reorganized to serve distant markets, production would focus on local and regional needs. This allows wealth to circulate internally, supporting education, infrastructure, and social stability over generations. Trade would still connect societies, but on more equal terms. Goods would be exchanged based on demand and mutual advantage rather than enforced dependency. Over time, this creates healthier economic relationships, where growth in one region contributes to global prosperity rather than concentrating benefits in a single center. Industrial and technological progress would also be less uneven. When knowledge and innovation are not restricted or extracted, multiple regions can advance simultaneously. This reduces the long-term gaps in productivity, income, and living standards that define the modern global economy. Economic shocks would likely have less widespread impact. A more balanced system is naturally more resilient, as it does not rely heavily on one dominant market or production hub. Local economies could adapt to change without facing collapse due to external decisions. While differences in wealth would still exist, they would be shaped by geography, policy, and innovation rather than historical exploitation. The result would be a world where opportunity is more widely distributed, and economic status is less strongly tied to events that occurred centuries earlier. Without colonialism, indigenous languages and cultures would remain central to daily life in many regions. Instead of being replaced or marginalized, local traditions would continue to evolve naturally, shaped by community needs and historical experience. Language is more than communication. It carries memory, values, and ways of thinking. In this alternative world, native languages would remain dominant in education, governance, and trade. Knowledge would be recorded and shared in local scripts and oral traditions, preserving diverse perspectives on science, philosophy, and history. Cultural practices such as art, music, clothing, and architecture would develop without external pressure to conform. Styles would change over time, but they would do so from within, blending tradition with innovation. This continuity strengthens identity and allows societies to modernize without losing their cultural roots. Belief systems and social customs would also maintain greater influence. Rather than being pushed aside, local moral frameworks would guide community life and conflict resolution. These systems often emphasize balance, responsibility, and connection to land, offering alternatives to purely economic measures of success. Cultural exchange would still occur through trade and travel, but it would be voluntary and mutual. Instead of cultural dominance, there would be cultural dialogue. Societies could adopt ideas they find useful while preserving what defines them. In such a world, cultural diversity would not be something to protect after the fact, it would simply be the natural state of humanity. Identity would be built on continuity rather than recovery, allowing cultures to thrive without first needing to survive erasure. Without colonial rule, cultural erasure would be far less common. Many communities lost traditions, histories, and social structures not through natural change, but through forced replacement. In a world without that pressure, identity would evolve rather than fracture. Cultural continuity allows societies to adapt while remaining grounded in their past. Customs, rituals, and social norms would shift gradually as conditions change, instead of being abandoned under external influence. This creates a stronger sense of belonging and historical confidence across generations. Education systems would reflect local values and knowledge. History would be taught from within the culture itself, reinforcing pride and understanding rather than distance or shame. Young generations would grow up seeing their heritage as a foundation for the future, not something to overcome. Names, clothing styles, and social roles would retain their meaning. Communities would not feel the need to reshape themselves to fit foreign standards in order to be considered modern or capable. Progress would be defined internally, not measured against an external model. This stability would also affect collective memory. Societies would remember their past through their own narratives, preserving achievements as well as lessons from failure. Historical continuity helps communities make sense of change without losing direction. Identity loss often creates long-term social tension, as people search for what was taken or suppressed. Without that disruption, societies would face fewer internal conflicts tied to questions of belonging. Cultural confidence would support cooperation, resilience, and creativity, shaping a world where diversity exists without hierarchy and identity does not require recovery. Technological advancement would still occur without colonialism, but it would not follow a single global blueprint. Instead of one dominant model spreading everywhere, innovation would emerge independently across regions, shaped by local needs, environments, and cultural priorities. Different societies face different challenges, and technology naturally responds to those challenges. Agricultural regions might focus on soil management, irrigation, and sustainable farming tools, while coastal societies could advance navigation, shipbuilding, and ocean-based resources. Mountainous areas might prioritize architecture and transport adapted to difficult terrain. Progress would be practical, grounded, and highly specialized. Knowledge exchange would happen through trade, travel, and diplomacy rather than control. Ideas would move between societies as inspiration, not instruction. This allows technologies to be adapted rather than copied, producing solutions that fit local social structures and values. Innovation becomes a dialogue, not a transfer. Without pressure to rapidly industrialize according to an external timeline, technological change could be more gradual and socially integrated. Communities would have time to adjust labor systems, education, and daily life alongside new tools. This reduces disruption and preserves social cohesion while still allowing advancement. Standardization would be less common, but creativity would be greater. Instead of one global system of production or communication, there would be many compatible but distinct systems. This diversity increases resilience, as no single failure would affect the entire world. Most importantly, technology would not be seen as a measure of superiority. Different forms of advancement would be valued equally, even if they look different. Progress would be defined by usefulness and sustainability rather than comparison. In this world, innovation would remain a shared human trait, but expressed in many forms. Technology would reflect cultural diversity rather than erase it, supporting a modern world built from multiple visions of what development can be. Even without colonialism, the world would not become a perfect place. Human societies would still experience conflict, competition, and inequality. Power struggles existed long before global expansion, and they would continue to shape history in different ways. However, the scale and structure of these challenges would be fundamentally different. Without a global system built on domination, inequality would grow more slowly and less rigidly. Differences between regions would reflect geography, leadership, and innovation rather than centuries of enforced imbalance. No society would begin the modern era with a built-in disadvantage rooted in historical extraction. Social problems would still exist, but they would be internal rather than inherited from external control. Communities would confront their own mistakes and successes directly, allowing responsibility and reform to emerge from within. This often leads to solutions that are more sustainable, because they align with local values and realities. Global relationships would be shaped by negotiation instead of legacy. Historical memory would focus less on recovery and more on continuity. Societies would not need to rebuild identity from loss, but could concentrate on growth, adaptation, and cooperation. This creates a different emotional foundation for international interaction, less resentment, more mutual recognition. The absence of colonialism would also change how history is understood. Progress would not be measured by how closely one society resembles another, but by how well it serves its people. Multiple models of success would exist side by side, each valid within its own context. Ultimately, this imagined world would not eliminate human flaws. It would simply remove one of the most disruptive forces that shaped modern inequality. The result would be a global story with many centers, many voices, and many paths forward, complex, imperfect, but more balanced than the world we know today. When we imagine a world where colonialism never happened, we are not searching for a perfect alternative reality. Instead, we are exploring how history could have unfolded with more balance, more voices, and more independent paths forward. This perspective reminds us that today's global inequalities, cultural losses, and political tensions are not accidents of fate, but results of specific historical systems. Understanding this does not change the past, but it sharpens how we see the present. It challenges the idea that progress must follow one model, one language, or one center of power. Human creativity, resilience, and intelligence have always existed everywhere, and they still do. By asking questions like this, we open space for empathy and reflection. We begin to see the modern world not as a finished product, but as something still being shaped by choices, values, and cooperation. History is complex, and so is humanity, but recognizing that complexity helps us imagine fairer possibilities ahead. Thank you for watching and spending this time exploring history from a different angle. If you found this perspective interesting, do not forget to like, share, and follow for more thoughtful stories about the world and how it came to be. See you in the next video.